Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will not agree to a ceasefire with Hamas. Speaking earlier in Tel Aviv, he said that would represent a surrender to Hamas. He called the conflict a battle between civilization and barbarism. He added that even the most just wars have unintended civilian casualties. Netanyahu also said he hoped that civilized nations would back Israel's fight.
I want to make clear Israel's position regarding a ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war for our common future. Today we draw a line between the forces of civilization and the forces of barbarism. It is a time for everyone to decide where they stand.
Our correspondent Ben Fazulin is in Jerusalem, and he told us more about what Netanyahu said.
What stood out to me was this plea to countries to support Israel and seek moral clarity in Benjamin Netanyahu's words. He said the future of civilization is at stake, and went on to explain that it's not Israel indiscriminately bombing civilians, it's Hamas, and Hamas which are using the Gazan civilians, 1 million of them displaced at the moment and seeking refuge, as human shields in this war.
Netanyahu took the stage shortly after it became known that an Israeli soldier who had been taken hostage by Hamas had actually been freed. How has that been received in Israel?
Well, this has been more than a glimmer of hope. I mean, the first good news in days. This war has entered its 4th week, and it's just been bloodshed from the terrorist attacks on October 7, in which 1,400 Israelis are said to have died. The airstrikes, which Hamas says in the Gaza Strip has killed over 8,000 people. They are unverified numbers. And then to hear that one of these hostages has been released. So far, only 4 had been released, and that was because of medical conditions, an elderly person included, and a number also killed in retaliatory airstrikes from Israel, according to Hamas. So this is really the first rescue, by the sounds of it. Israel clarifying an earlier statement saying that Uri Magadish, a private, had been released during the ground offensive by Hamas.
That was Ben Fazulin with the latest from Jerusalem. Thanks for that. And for more, we can now bring in Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He's a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Good to see you, Mr. Conricus. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu categorically rejects calls for a ceasefire, equating it with calling for Israel's defeat in the war. But what about a humanitarian pause to help innocent civilians get aid and get out of harm's way? Wouldn't that also be in the IDF's interest?
Hello, good evening, and thank you for having me. It is definitely our interest to make the best possible situation for civilians. They are not our enemy, and we are not trying to target them. And in order to do so, we are facilitating, together with the Egyptians and the US and the UN, the import of humanitarian aid. I'm happy to say that more than 108 trucks of humanitarian aid have been provided to Gaza, and that there is a humanitarian zone declared and officially established humanitarian zone in the southern Gaza Strip, all in order to provide, exactly as you say, some kind of support for the Palestinians, the non-combatants. But we have to be very clear. Any cessation in fighting will be used by Hamas for their purposes, and that is not on the table. I don't see it on the table. What we are focused on is on dismantling Hamas and making sure that this never happens again, and of course, bringing back our hostages.
Yeah, just to clarify about that humanitarian aid that is trickling in, 100 trucks have so far since October 7th been brought to Gazans. That is usually what comes in throughout a day, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I want to get to something else because Israel describes the Al-Shifa hospital as a de facto Hamas command center. The UN says hundreds of people are stuck there and cannot be moved. There is an evacuation order that the IDF has issued. Is there a scenario in which the IDF would consider refraining from bombing what it considers valuable military targets on humanitarian grounds?
Yes, listen, we are very respectful of protected sites, and we fight according to the laws of armed conflict. We distinguish between combatant and non-combatant, and we are attacking the combatants, full stop. Second thing is, it's known and widely recognized that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure for their military purposes, which is in direct contradiction to humanitarian law. It's a crime. They shouldn't be able to do that. And the unfortunate situation is that even though 2 weeks have passed, almost 2 weeks have passed since we asked Palestinians to evacuate Gaza City, they have had lots of time to evacuate also the Shifa hospital if they had been busy doing it. Now they're in a situation where they still haven't evacuated, and there is significant combat ongoing. That is regrettable, and I think that everybody in Gaza, the aid organizations and Hamas, the UN, and everybody else should be busy evacuating people and to strip Hamas of that human shield, which is the Shifa hospital.
What the UN says, though, is that there are people on ventilators, babies in incubators that just simply cannot be moved, and that moving them would amount to, putting them in harm's way in a different way, and would also suppose a death sentence. But I want to move on because your military managed to free a hostage overnight. Can you give us any details about that operation?
Yeah, just to finish that last point, what's really putting them at risk, at mortal danger, is the fact that Hamas is using it for their military purposes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about Shifa. It's a protected facility, and we wouldn't have any issue with it. Regarding the happy news of the release of Private Ori Megidish, she's with her family. She is well, both mentally and physically, and she has been debriefed, and she will be debriefed in the future. She was released by Israeli forces on a ground operation. Due to the sensitivity of the matter, I cannot elaborate how many people, how it was done, where she was held, and all of the other very interesting details. What I can say and reiterate is that we are committed to getting all of our people back, not only Ori Megidish, but all of the 238 hostages that are being held in Gaza by Hamas.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.